The briefing is brought to you in association with the Sustainable Cities in Action Forum at Expo City Dubai. The Sustainable Cities in Action Forum at Expo City Dubai is a place for city leaders, developers, architects and designers to come together and innovate for the future of urban spaces. It's an opportunity for the Global South to convene in the Global South. It's a testbed for real-world solutions that will shape the future of people and planet. You can hear from the innovative thinkers and inspirational voices that drove the narrative at this year's edition by listening to Monocle's special episodes of The Briefing, recorded live at Expo City Dubai in March. Find and listen to the shows now at monocle.com or wherever you get your podcasts. The Sustainable Cities in Action Forum 2024. Collaborate, innovate, transform.
You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 19th of April 2024 on Monocle Radio. It is 1400 in Jerusalem, 1300 in Bratislava, midday here in London, and 7 a.m. in New York City. You're listening to Monocle Radio. The Briefing starts now. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program, Israel retaliates for Iran's retaliation over Israel's strike on an Iranian consulate. Will that be the end of it? We'll get the latest from Iran and a UN vote on the root of all of this.
The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council.
The US vetoes a United Nations Security Council resolution that would recognize Palestine. After that, we'll look at a private funding effort for Ukraine in Slovakia, seeking to circumvent the opposition of Slovakia's Prime Minister, Robert Fico. We'll also get a roundup of the latest film and television news, and finally,
how people tend to sit in Copenhagen might be different from how people want to sit in Milan or how people want to sit in Lagos or how people... So I think in that aspect, there should always be a cultural aspect to design, so to speak.
Monocle's team at Salone del Mobile in Milan is wrapping up today and brings us a design work that highlights the plight of migrants in the Mediterranean. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. It has been a tense week in the Middle East as the world waited for Israel's response to a barrage of missiles and drones launched at Israel by Iran. This itself a response to Israel's strike at the start of this month on an Iranian consulate in Syria. Overnight, Israel was the one to retaliate with a reported strike in central Iran, something the US had warned it not to do, but something that nevertheless appears to have been carefully calibrated to avoid an all-out war between Iran and Israel. Meanwhile, the crisis at the root of all of this, namely the Israeli-Palestinian crisis, took another turn yesterday as the US vetoed a UN Security Council resolution that would have recommended the state of Palestine be admitted to the United Nations. Well, joining me to discuss all of this is Paul Rogers, Open Democracy's international security expert, and Steve Crawshaw, former director of Human Rights Watch UK and previously UN Advocacy Director. We'll start with you, Paul. Thanks for coming on the show. What do we know about the extent of Israel's strike here on central Iran at this point?
It's rather curious. When the news was first coming out at about 5 a.m. London time, then the implications were that there had been several strikes, certainly somewhere on or near Isfahan, and then maybe a strike up near Tabriz, and possibly strikes in Syria and Iraq. Since then, it's concentrated almost entirely on what happened in Isfahan, where there was an attack on Shakara Air Base, quite near the city. That seems to have been fairly small. So the overall message seems to be, unless we hear differently, that there's just been sort of one demonstration shot, and I think that's probably the correct term to use, by the Israelis. There were indications that this was also affecting Natanz, which was a nuclear facility. But Natanz actually is in another part of Isfahan province, about 100 kilometers away. So as far as one can tell, while Isfahan is actually an important site, both in terms of an airbase and military manufacturing plants, it is not hugely significant on the nuclear side. And most significantly of all, the International Atomic Energy Authority has reported there's been no damage whatsoever, as far as they can tell, to Iran's nuclear facilities. And since they are under inspection by the IAEA, we can take that more or less for certain. So overall, and it's a long-winded answer, it's relatively small, symbolic to a large extent, and it indicates that both Iran and Israel aren't prepared to go to a major war at the present time, which is probably good news for everybody.
A demonstration strike, as you call it, and also one that both sides, it appears at least for now, are sort of playing down, both in official sources and in the media. Is that a good sign for you that both Iran as well as Israel are perhaps hoping that this is enough of it?
I think that is true. I suspect that the Iranians will be happy with this, insofar as they're ever happy with what Israel does. But on the Israeli side, I think that's rather more problematic. One of the key, very far-right members of Netanyahu's cabinet has actually said that he described it in a tweet as basically very minor. And this, of course, hasn't gone down well because it implies that it's releasing information that Israel was responsible. So there'll be differences within Israel. One suspects that Netanyahu probably had to be dragged kicking and screaming into really making this small strike and may well want to go further. And certainly some of the senior military people in the cabinet, the war cabinet that is, were also that way inclined. So I think there's probably been remarkably strong pressure from Biden on this, just as there now appears to be pressure from Biden on what's going to happen in Gaza, and particularly trying to get the Israelis not to go for a full assault on Rafah, because the indications were that the Israelis were preparing to do this, and maybe the demonstration shot on Iran was part cover for this. Because the one thing which one can be pretty sure about is that as far as Israel is concerned, all what has happened between them and Iran is good news because it really sidelines the significance of Gaza, where the real problems are developing and, in fact, getting steadily worse by the day.
Well, Steve, I want to bring you in on that because, as Paul mentions there, the root of this conflict in so many ways is the war in Gaza. You were recently in the region. What did you learn about the situation, the mood on the ground there?
The mood, I think no one will be surprised, including anyone watching around the world, but very, very bleak. I was very struck by, obviously, this is a divided place, divided communities in any case, but what has happened with first the 7th of October and the horror of that, which is very much the main narrative within Israel, bring the hostages back and what needs to be done for that. And on the other hand, as described now, those tens of thousands who have died in Gaza, it makes it, I basically hardly met anybody who found any way of finding some kind of optimism moving forward. I was very struck by that. Even those who were trying very, very hard to think of some way of saying before the darkness, the light, if you like, and there is, a theoretical case that can be made for that. But fundamentally, that digging in has been very, very strong. There's no question on that.
And Steve, I wonder how also you feel the war in Gaza has focused minds internationally on the need for a two-state solution. There are these two aspects Paul was also mentioning. On the one hand, we have a possible invasion of Rafah, but we also have internationally this UN Security Council vote on possible Palestinian membership to the United Nations.
Exactly. So that vote at the United Nations Security Council, incredibly interesting. This is clearly the horror of what's been happening in recent months, and that includes both the 7th of October and what followed, has definitely focused minds in many different ways. And the issues we've seen in the last couple of days have again reminded all of us that the stakes are very, very high. So Palestine had asked before to be recognized as a state. That was way back in 2011. That didn't go anywhere. It's now returning in a very different climate. So what happened at the Security Council in New York yesterday was that the The United States voted no, which therefore means a veto, and therefore that couldn't go through. But I think in some ways more interesting is that others were voting yes for that. That includes France, fellow permanent member of the Security Council, other European countries on the Security Council, and Britain did what it quite often does, is sit on its hands and abstained on the issue. So we had the United States alone voting. Israel, of course, very, very unhappy with this proposal. But basically, this comes now in a very different context of people around the world saying something does need to be done. And of course, it's not just that sense of member state or not, but the political pressures for that are certainly very great, but something needs to happen. But in parallel to that, and where the Security Council and its politicization can't get involved, a number of legal issues obviously are happening, both the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. Things are moving in both those places in ways that Israel is deeply uncomfortable about, as became very clear to me, including during my trip recently.
And Paul, just to bring you in on this one more time as well, I mean, what is your sense, I suppose, of Iran's stake in Gaza, the international community's stake in Gaza at this point? I just wonder if they will sort of be hoping, what's the best case scenario, I suppose, in this case? What does Iran want to do to try and influence what's happening in Gaza? And what does the US want to do on the other side?
Well, Iran influences indirectly, both through its contacts with the Houthis in Yemen, some militias in Iraq and Syria, and, of course, the Hezbollah in Lebanon. And Iran, historically, for many years, has been very antagonistic to what it considers the Zionist regime in Israel. The international community, highly variable. The global South as a whole is really very antagonistic to what the West is doing, particularly countries like the United States and Britain, which they see in strong support for Israel. One thing which is being rather missed out of this is there are another two elements in this. One is what is happening on the occupied West Bank and what is happening about within the Arab community within Israel, the citizens of Israel. Now, on the West Bank, the situation is really getting very grim. There are repeated reports of settlers dressed in military uniform, and they are obviously reservists at times, really staging attacks on Arab villages and just killing people. And of course, also not so much on the West Bank and East Jerusalem. There's been huge areas released for further building of settlements. And then within Israel itself, in best part of 2 million Arab Israelis are really cowed by this and extremely worried personally. Many incidences of people just getting sacked for appearing to support what's happening in Gaza. Many others actually even being arrested. That's a whole area which is really being missed, or mostly missed, at least in the Western world, that there's a lot going wrong within Israeli Arab community and particularly the occupied West Bank. You put it all together, and I'm afraid even though we seem to be recovering from the risk of a major war with Iran, we're a long way from seeing anything approaching peace in Israel and the occupied territories just for now.
And Steve, just finally on that, given what Paul is describing there, all the risks of escalation with Iran, but also in Gaza, do you get the sense, I mean, what's the next step for the Security Council at the United Nations in your mind? Could we expect another vote on Palestine? What else can they do?
I don't think there'll be another vote immediately. I'm just seconding everything that Paul had just said. Exactly that bleakness that he described, I think, is a really important background to this. It was ironic to hear the Israeli ambassador here yesterday complaining about the quote-unquote politicization of the Security Council, whereas, of course, overwhelmingly otherwise, others see the politicization as going in the other direction. I think that there is now a new pressure that something will need to happen there. I think that America finds itself in a very uncomfortable place. It was able to basically lord it over the issues before. Not only America, but America most dominantly, was always going to be protecting Israel. That's now got more difficult, partly because of what's happening on the ground and partly because of shifts in public opinion in the United States as well. So all of that creates really new pressures. Whether we get any solutions out of this, God knows, but certainly the pressures are going to be greater than ever.
Thanks very much both to Paul Rogers and Steve Crawshaw there. Now here's Mariella Bevan with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. Indians have begun voting in the world's largest election as Prime Minister Narendra Modi seeks a historic third term. Today's phase is the first and largest of 7, covering 166 million voters in 102 constituencies across 21 states and territories. A Polish man has been arrested and charged with planning to cooperate with Russian intelligence services to aid the possible assassination of Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. Polish prosecutors said the man named Paweł K. was allegedly tasked with collecting information about an airport in Poland used by Ukraine's president. And Kenya's military chief has died after a military helicopter crashed in the west of the country. General Francis Omondi Ogola, Kenya's highest-ranking military officer, was in the helicopter alongside 11 other military personnel. Only 2 people survived. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Mariella. In Slovakia, it is fair to say that Prime Minister Robert Fico's support for Ukraine and contrasting pro-Russian rhetoric has ebbed and flowed this year. In a meeting with Ukraine's Prime Minister last week, he wholeheartedly backed Ukraine and said Slovakia was here to help. This despite refusing to join a Czech-led effort to procure arms for Ukraine, and this week saying that Russia will never give up Crimea, the Donbass or Luhansk. This back and forth has led private citizens in Slovakia to launch a crowdfunding initiative for Ukraine this week, launched with the help of a 99-year-old Holocaust survivor, and which has already raised some 1.5 million euros. Well, joining me now for more is Lukáš Onderčanin. He's the head of Foreign News Desk of the Foreign News Desk at the Slovak daily SME. Lukáš, thanks so much for joining us. Let's start with Robert Fico himself. Do we really have a clear idea at this point of where he stands on Ukraine? Is this a case of sort of saying one thing internationally and one thing domestically?
Good afternoon. Yes, exactly. It's mostly about his rhetoric. He's trying to play on both sides. One of the questions was the elections that we just recently had in Slovakia. And before the elections, he was very radical and not supporting Russia maybe directly, but criticizing Ukraine and saying that there will be no other arming or sending any ammunition to Ukraine, and that there should be some peace talk. But after last week's meeting between Slovak and Ukrainian government, he softened his rhetoric and he said he's supporting Ukraine joining EU as soon as possible. So I think he's somewhere in between, trying to play on both sides, but on the other thing is the elections and his support, because many of his voters are openly pro-Russian. So he's trying to keep them and also maybe not lose those who are maybe more pro-Western oriented.
Well, and his shift in some ways is, I suppose, support for Ukraine, but saying he wants peace, perhaps without arms, if that is even possible in a full-scale invasion like this. Do you detect in that sense that there is any shift in his, not just tone, but what he might actually do to support Ukraine?
Well, Slovakia stopped sending military assistance or ammunition to Ukraine, but there are still business contracts, and the government is not talking about that much, but also people directly in the government are maybe a little bit involved in producing weapons, and so there are a lot of contracts that the government can get money. So obviously they will not stop business deals with Ukraine. But now it's mostly about rhetoric, and we'll see if something will change. Because I don't think that Fico wants to make big enemies with Ukraine. But so far, it was mostly about rhetoric, I would say.
Well, if he does not want to make an enemy of Ukraine, tell us perhaps what he thinks about and how this private funding effort is going. How did this start? It seems to have gained support very quickly.
Yes, so it was a civil initiative organized by Slovak NGO Peace for Ukraine. And it's been on for nearly 4 days, and the people collected nearly 2 million euros right now. So it might seem that it's a huge number of people that are kind of protesting with this against the government of Robert Fico, because for sure he is maybe not happy to see this initiative, especially in the international media. But it's maybe not a huge number of people. It's 30,000 people. But we could see that, especially after the elections, where pro-Western and pro-Ukraine candidate Ivan Korčok lost in the second round, people got mobilized more, and they want to support Ukraine more. And we can see it in other areas in civil society. There are some protests. So this is maybe the way to express that Slovakia is not just about government of Robert Fico that might seem more pro-Russian.
And how then broad do you imagine this is, even if, as you say, the numbers, at least at this point, of those actually supporting this private funding effort might be smaller? I mean, the slogan of this effort is, if the government won't, we will. Do you expect that this might galvanize a bit more public support that may have, otherwise perhaps stopped financially supporting Ukraine?
Well, if we look at polls, there is like maybe 1/3 of the society that would still say that they are okay with supporting Ukraine, even militarily. But yes, in the past 2 years, the support decreased quite a lot. So we can probably expect there'll be some more money in this initiative. And there were some initiatives that are similar in a couple of months ago. I think they collected over 600,000 euros for the mining system that is being sent to Ukraine probably right now, around these weeks. So in the past months, we've seen many local small initiatives that are trying to support Ukraine. I talk with many volunteers that are going there alone with their own cars, buying medical stuff, and they're going to the front line. So there is still a part of population that is clearly pro-Ukrainian and supporting the war effort, and they are not saying that they should capitulate, because this is basically what the government of Robert Fico is saying.
Lukasz Onderchanin there. Thank you very much for joining us. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. I'm Chris Chermak. Now it's time to get a look at the latest film and television releases hitting our screens this week and over the weekend with the film, TV and culture critic Ashanti Omkar. Ashanti, welcome to the show. We're going to first look at this week's big new cinematic release, The Book of Clarence. Tell us more about it.
Well, this is what I would call a genre-bending, film. It's got a big cast. You rarely get to see Lakeith Stanfield, Omar Sy, Anna Diop, David Oyelowo, Michael Ward, Alfred Woodard, all of them coming together. Benedict Cumberbatch will give you a very surprising turn, let's say it, and James McAvoy. Amazing cast, made by British director James Samuel. He's the brother of Seal, the singer. And he's already made one film before that has been it's been received in various ways, is what I would say with James, because he seems to have a very musical brain, but he's also very good at visualizing it. And this film is, as you would expect, The Book of Clarence, you'd expect it to have a biblical kind of idea around it. And it's almost like a Ten Commandments style. It reminded me of kind of Ben-Hur when watching it. But it is a very Marmite, is the word I would use. You may love it, you may hate it. But it is one of those films that is certainly a very interesting one to be releasing, because you get to see a lot about, I would say he engages in kind of black politics. He engages in music. He engages in showcasing Jerusalem in a way we've never seen before. Very, very, very interesting film to watch. Definitely pops on the big screen.
There is, as you say, so many stars in this. That's always a risk, isn't it, when you throw so many names into one film? How are they all working together?
They're actually working really well together. I would say that is what gives this film more gravitas than the actual kind of script itself, because a lot of this is a story. It's almost like he has really read a lot about the apostles, etc., in the Bible, and then said, let's put this film together. But this cast will delight you. I have to say, seeing Omar Sy as a gladiator, and I won't tell you what Benedict Cumberbatch plays, but let's just say that you will be delighted. Okay,
we'll wait to see what Benedict Cumberbatch plays in this film. Let's move on to one other thing, streaming on Disney Plus starting this Friday, The Bon Jovi Story. Tell us more.
Oh gosh, so I was at the premiere. I know it's unbelievable to many of us that John Bon Jovi himself is now 61 years old.
I will out myself as a teen Bon Jovi fan, so I am curious about this.
Oh gosh, yes. Let's just say that you will come out very inspired. I've seen one episode. John Bon Jovi and Team Bon Jovi were all there at the screening, right in front of me, which was quite dazzling, to be very honest. You know, they are still rock stars in their own right. But what was really interesting is that John Bon Jovi had some issues with his voice as he started aging, and in this, you start to see how he desperately wants to be back on stage. He wants to keep going, and he doesn't want to stop singing. It's his, you know, it's his life. It's his life's work. And he's talking about legacy, you know, and it's about how he's dreamt this job, how he's created his life. And you get to see he and his bandmates. And also you'll get very interesting glimpse of people like Bruce Springsteen, whom Bon Jovi knew, you know, throughout those olden days. And how they, as rock stars, what is the legacy they leave behind? Do they keep making music? This is the question they're asking. And it certainly left me delighted, I have to say.
I suppose so many of these aging rock stars are to some extent facing this question about how much longer to go on.
Yes, exactly. This is something that I was thinking about quite a lot as well, because I just thought to myself, with someone like John Bon Jovi, what if he can't sing anymore? What will he do with his life? This is what he's thinking about, you know? And I guess he is working, and what you'll see in this documentary, especially in episode 1, is what he is willing to do and put himself through. And he said, I've never worked harder in my life than I'm working right now. Because when he was younger, it all came quite easily to him in so many ways. You know, he wasn't musically trained, but he had an affinity towards it. He had a talent for it. So he became this massive star. But, you know, a lot of stars are driven by this audience that loves them. They're gushing for them. They're screaming for them. So when that potentially is going to stop, what happens next? This is what this documentary is looking at. It's a docuseries, I have to say. It's 4 episodes.
What happens next is perhaps the avatars of ABBA, but we won't go there for now. Let's look at one other story or one other film coming out, Sugar, on Apple TV, starring Colin Farrell.
That's right. So this is actually a series. It's also, you know, I've said genre bending already for the Book of Clarence. It's the same with this. This is a very kind of film noir style series. In this one, the fantastic Colin Farrell acts in this, and Kirby Howell-Baptiste is also in this. And Colin Farrell, you know, we've seen him most recently in The Banshees of Inisherin, which had so many, you know, it was very much big in the Oscar season and the award season. In this case, you know, he solved a case in Japan. He's a private eye. His name is John Sugar. He's come to LA. He's been asked to find a missing woman, and she's got ties with a Hollywood legend. Now, he is already doing all this investigative work and thinking something's not right here. The full story is not coming to me. So he teams up with Kirby Howell-Baptiste as Ruby, who is like, you know, is shown as his kind of BFF, his best friend forever. And they are detectives who are trying to find out what's happening with this series. But let me just say that at one point, there will be a twist. And while watching this, you've got to watch it very carefully, because you will, you know, it's got 8 episodes. We're already, you know, Apple TV's already dropped 4 of those episodes. And, you know, it will really delight you, because if you keep tabs on this very carefully, you will see that this builds up into a very different picture. I'm not going to give you a spoiler, but let's just say that there is a twist in this that I certainly did not see coming, although I felt it coming, if that makes sense.
3 great items there, leaving us hanging. Ashanti Omkar, thank you very much. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And finally, on today's show, we are back in Milan for Salone del Mobile. The Lagos-based Nifemi Marcos Bello is the founder of the design studio Numbello, whose design ethos is rooted in empathy. This year, he's showcasing Omi Io, a stainless steel structure that highlights the plight of migrants crossing the Mediterranean Sea. Monocle's editor-at-large, Europe editor-at-large, Ed Stalker, caught up with Nifemi on the sidelines of this year's Design Week. He started by asking him about his feelings around showcasing his work.
This is my first Salone, and I was a bit skeptical to show this here because it's not your typical design object, so to speak. I know Salone is filled with chairs, tables, stools, lights, but this is not. This is not. And it was shown in Miami, as I said earlier, last year in December. and it was a joint project with the head curator for Design Miami last year, Anna Karnik, and she thought it would be a brilliant idea to actually bring it in to Milan because of the subject matter of migration and the inspiration behind it. And I thought it was an incredible way to kind of use design to spark a dialogue as well. I know that in the past, especially when we did it in Miami, a lot of dialogue was had within participants of Design Miami staff, and also people who visited Design Miami around the subject matter of migration. So, yeah.
The name is saltwater in Yoruba, but I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it. I'm going to leave that to you.
Saltwater in English, but it's called...
From the Yoruba, saltwater in English. Yeah. Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, tell me, just give an idea of what this actually looks like for our listeners.
So it's an abstract piece. It's made out of stainless steel. It looks like a boat, and it's polished. And the idea is that when visitors are walking past it, they can see their reflection and see themselves and pause within the sculpture. But underneath the sculpture, actually, every hour we're pouring salt into the sculpture and salt drops into the ground. And the reason is because it was an encounter that I actually had with a migrant actually in Italy who told me about a traumatic experience that he had with seawater entering his mouth and him having PTSD from salt. He was Senegalese. And the salt that we're using here is actually pink, to pay homage to the pink lake in Senegal.
Indeed. And you know, you mentioned how, first of all, you mentioned sort of meeting Cubans in Miami and then bringing it over here. You also said about how, you know, Salone is often furniture pieces, chairs. This is a little different. How was it wading into, obviously, what is a difficult subject matter, something that obviously has political, you know, weight. There's a far-right government here in Italy who has controversial, for lots of people, opinions on migration. Did you think about all of that when you brought it over, and did you want to wade into that discussion?
Of course I did. And for me, I think one of the conversations that I've had, which is quite interesting actually, is that a lot of people think that design in itself can't be too political, or can't be political. I've had a conversation with a few visitors around the subject matter, and I find it fascinating that the design world tends to kind of shut the door behind them when things are happening. Things in the world are actually happening.
Well, that's funny, because space is political, or it can be.
It can be, exactly. But I think, are we doing enough though to actually maybe have discourse and conversations around that?
Well, I think, I mean, that's over to you for that one. That's your cue. Yeah. Maybe next year you can get some debates going on it. Yeah, have a discussion.
I think discussions through actual physical products. I say, for example, there should be more ethnographic approaches to design in itself. So how people tend to sit in Copenhagen might be different from how people want to sit in Milan, or how people want to sit in Lagos, or how people... So I think in that aspect, there should always be a cultural aspect to design, so to speak. And it seems like a lot of the ideas and design, in my own opinion, tend to be recycled. I joke, and I don't know, I mean, I grew up in Africa, so it might be different, but I say, for example, the way my parents live or lived is different from how I live now. So we live in smaller spaces. We probably work from home a lot longer than they do. So how do these spaces evolve, or how have they evolved? So if you're thinking about it from that standpoint as well, it seems like, again, a lot of brands, furniture brands, contemporary furniture brands tend to just bring new colorways in and not have conversations around those types of subject matter.
And this is meant to be the place where those conversations are happening.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's important to have your voice here.
Yep.
I mean, how's the reaction been? How have visitors reacted to this? Talking of conversations, have you had interesting dialogue with a wide range of different people who've reacted to it?
I have had extremely interesting dialogues. I think it's beautiful that a lot of people have approached me and said that it's extremely poetic. In my own honest opinion, I didn't realize how poetic design could be. And I kind of feel like I've been educated on that, even just by doing this project. I also think that it's something to do with my own background, where in Africa, design and art usually tend to be in the same spaces. So if you see a stool that's made in Lagos, for example, and crafted, you don't know if it's art or if it's functional or if it's art. So for me, I don't, as a designer, the way I tend to practice, or I think practicing moving forward, to be honest, is not blurring the lines, which actually puts in both practices together.
That was Nifemi Marcus Bello in conversation with Monocle's Ed Stalker. And that's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Paige Reynolds. Our researcher was George Ruskin, and our studio manager was Lily Austin. The Briefing is back on Monday at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.